Hey guys, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. It might seem like this is a lot of information for one question, and it is, but that's okay. For your purposes, you need to think about who and what are the major ideas about his political theories. And I know this is a lot, but this actually represents a lot of what's actually going on in Italian politics, and his theories have a long-term effect on the development of political science and still are things we talk about today in the political science world. So he's a pretty big deal, and at most you'll get a quick intro into Machiavelli and why he is such a big deal in the political science world. So here we go. Niccolo Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. He was raised in the Florentine middle class, which meant he had access to education. And through this education, he actually learned business mathematics. Imagine that. Business mathematics. We've been talking about how people stay in the field all day, and this guy gets to learn specifically how to do accounting. Because of this, he actually gets a job in Rome, and he works for a Florentine banker. And for about 7 years he does this, and he comes back to Florence and finds out that the Medici family, who actually had been running Florence for a couple of decades at this point, at this time the Medici family had been banished. So this means that there is a window of opportunity for Machiavelli, and he actually enters Florentine politics. During his time with the Florentine government, he goes on various political expeditions to France. He also deals with the Pope quite often. And while working for the Florentine government, Machiavelli gets to know a guy named Caesar Borgia, who at the time was the Duke of Romagna, or Romania? I'm not sure exactly. But Machiavelli meets this guy who's a Borgia. Maybe you've heard of the Borgias. There's a popular television show about the Borgia family. And Machiavelli meets this guy, and even though this guy is quite cruel and he's a vicious politician, Machiavelli actually sees him as an effective leader, and this guy wishes to unify Italy, and this is something that Machiavelli had actually believed in because he, as a Florentine person, had seen multiple invasions by France into Italy, and so Machiavelli had this strong feeling that all of Italy should unite, because as Jim was saying, there's major city-states, and right now, if Florence gets invaded, what does that mean for them? It means they got to hire mercenaries or rely on whatever they got. So this is an early idea of unification. So moving on, eventually Machiavelli gets booted out because the Medici family regains power in Florence and they dismiss him from office. Right after he gets dismissed from office, he's wrongly accused of conspiring to overthrow the Medici's rule in Florence. And because of this, he resides to the country where he begins to write. And that is where he's going to write The Prince, as well as other things. So, the desire to write The Prince comes out of his desire to return to Florentine politics. And it was actually dedicated, The Prince was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the governor of Florence at the time. And so this book called The Prince was written between the period of 1513 and 1521, and it is a strong example of a realist political view. So, a realist political view, or realism, I'm going to borrow a definition from online because it's quick, and I think it summarizes it pretty well. Awareness or acceptance of the facts and necessities of life, a practical rather than a moral or dogmatic view of things. So what was realist about The Prince? Machiavelli felt that there should be a separation of moral and ethical norms, or codes, when it comes to politics. The idea of a new prince takes a central role in this work by Machiavelli. A ruler must be willing to do unmoral things if it is to protect his reputation. So there is a difference between a prince's public display of morality and the private morality, in that a prince must be willing to do anything to maintain power while also keeping a good image. This leads us to Machiavelli's most famous line from The Prince, which is that the ends justify the means. Maybe you have heard this before. But in other words, he's saying that in order to get what you want, you must do what you need to do in order to get there. And this kind of gets oversimplified, and so does like the idea of the prince in Machiavelli's theories. And today you might actually hear someone say Machiavellian, or like that was pretty Machiavelli of you, as kind of a derogatory term. And we see it a lot like with American politicians who we accuse them of doing anything for votes as long as it maintains their power or will push them further in their career. Unfortunately, this isn't entirely true, and there are some good things that the prince offers us. For instance, Machiavelli believes strongly in the idea of free will, and that self-confidence can actually fight off divine destiny. So again, this is saying that politicians such as princes must do what they need to do to maintain power and do what's best for maybe the city or kingdom. But the idea of free will and like separating ethical code and morality code from the church is a lot different than what we have seen, especially in the medieval ages, where like the ethic and moral aspects of the church are way more dominant than what an individual king or ruler or merchant has to say about anything. And Machiavelli is really pushing this idea that you should not be ruling by this morality. You should be taking that out of what is at play when it comes to politics and having political stability. So, in Machiavelli's other works, he does talk about like the idea of patriotism and having like a Republican type government or a representative type government. But for the most part, history remembers the prince and Machiavelli as a voice for manipulative and selfish political philosophy. And even if this wasn't his goal, maybe it was, this is how we actually kind of see a lot of Renaissance politics, and it's a lot of this rise of people outside the norm, like the feudal system, who are rising to power, especially in Italy. And these powerful people and groups are now moving outside the ethical codes for personal gain, but they're also doing it for the purpose of political stability, even if it does mean that a good amount of people do get screwed in the long run. But that is what we got about Machiavelli. I hope you can see the connections between what he's talking about and Italian political theories, and maybe you learned something about realism and Machiavellianism. So, cool. Have a good night.